All right, guys, let's get started here. How's everyone doing? Good? Okay. All right. Any questions on anything from this class so far? Anything that requires clarification? On anything? On any of the subjects? So today we're covering what in the notes is a short chapter, chapter 8, production in the long run. So might go a little bit quicker just because it's normally pretty quick in a normal classroom setting. But there's a few things I want to make sure that are clear with you guys as we go over this chapter. And then I might introduce rapidly like the 3 chapters to come. Just to kind of give you guys a bit of an intro into that and give you guys more time the next few weeks to cover more material because those chapters are a little bit more substantive in size. So the first thing I want to kind of clarify with you guys is that, well, in chapter 7, we talked about production in the short run. And in chapter 8, we're still talking about production, but now we're talking about in the long run. The analogy I'd give you guys to understand kind of short run versus long run, there's a few I'll give you guys just to make sure it's clear what we're talking about. But I would say that later on in the semester, when we get to the other market structures in the next 2 chapters, we're often going to be talking about like what happens now and what happens over time. Anyways, to come back to this idea here, I would say that production in the short run, if I were to compare it to like other terms that you're used to seeing, this could be seen as the present. And production in the long run could be seen as the future. Okay, this is going to sound a little vague, and we're going to tie it back to the actual material because this is not how it's normally referred to, but I'm giving an attempt on this time around to try to see if it sticks, if it makes sense for you guys. But if we think about 2021, like January 2021, if we think about that today, that is in the future. It's further down the road. But once we reach January 2021, we're all of a sudden in the present. If I ask you like what's going on January 5th, 2021, and we are January 25th, 2021, well, you would say like we're in the present. We're in this current moment right now. It's no longer the future. Why I like to make this distinction between these two is there's a distinction between how we analyze these two. This is a current state, and this is a planning process. So there's a difference between the two. Like this is the state that you will be in. State that you're in as a business. Like we're talking about as a business here, not as an individual. And here, this production in the long run is a planning process. When January 1st is going to roll in, maybe some of you will take on like challenges or goals for 2021 on how to live a better lifestyle for yourself. Well, when you take those challenges or those goals or those objectives, you're kind of telling yourself, well, in the next year, by December, this is what I want to accomplish. Okay? You're planning things out. But once you reach December, you're no longer in the future. You're kind of, either you evaluate whether you've accomplished that or not. Okay? So the big difference between the two is when we talk about production in the long run, we never get to the long run, you know, like we never kind of like, as soon as we get there, we're in the short run again. So it's always going to be seen as this planning process. So the big thing here to note is later on, when we talk about the different market structures, and I'll say, like, let's say you're in perfect competition and you're currently losing money or you're currently making profits. What's going to happen over time? Okay. Well, what's going to happen over time, you'll still be looking at the short-run cost curves. You won't be looking at the long-run cost curves. Okay, so I'm saying this for the first time today. It's going to be vague now, but as I repeat this over the next few chapters, hopefully it's going to become clear. Okay. So what characterizes the difference between short-run and long-run? So if I were to ask you when is the future? Is the future, like, is tomorrow the future? Is it in a month's time? Is it further down the road? Well, it's the same kind of idea here between short-run and long-run. But the big thing that makes our situation be seen as long run is when all factors of production are variable. That is the time horizon. Okay. So if I have a Subway or I have whatever store here in Lennoxville or factory, well, tomorrow or a month from now, even though I'm in the future, I'm not in the long run. Okay? I'm not in the long run because I can't just switch all my factors of production in that time horizon. What we mean by all factors of production, well, here all factors of production, the different factors of production that there's labor. Well, in a month's time, it's quite feasible for me to hire more people, to have more workers working for me. That's feasible. I could also think of my equipment. Unless there's a shortage of ovens or cash registers, I could probably double the amount of equipment in the next month. But here I'm also referring to space, like the size of my restaurant, the amount of seats, the amount of people I could accommodate, the amount of parking space. This here takes more than a month to have it variable. But if I ask you like if you're planning things out for in like 2 years' time, because there's this project that says that in 2 years' time, Bishops will now have double the amount of students that it does now. Well, in 2 years' time, it's easier for the owner of the Subway in Lennoxville to try to find a larger space or to try to kind of grow or something else. So that when you can change all your factors of production and everything else, that is when you're in the long run. It's when you have that sufficient time to changing all factors of production. So you can think that different industries have different time spans for short run and long run. If you offer services like acupuncture services or something else and you already have a space and the office next door, like the commercial space next door to you is vacant and you wanted to double the space, it could be quite rapid. You could just kind of rent it out. You could kind of change, make it all cute and paint it out, make it zen, hire a few extra therapists and double the amount of people that you can see in a week as your business. Not yourself, but like your business could see double. So in that kind of framework, the long run would be a short enough time horizon because you're able to grow really rapidly. If you're producing cars, trucks, planes, well, the long run's a lot longer. Like there's different brands like Tesla that are pushing to try to produce more, produce new cars. Well, before they could do so, they have to build their factory and so on and so forth. So it's a long time horizon. If they want to double capacity, they want to double their sales, double their production, it takes a certain amount of time because building all that specialized space and equipment and everything else that's required is a lengthy process. So the long run is not a specific time. Like when I wouldn't ask you this question, but if I would, If you can't say the long run is like a month down the road or 6 months down the road or a year down the road. It's not like anything within the year is the short run and anything beyond is the long run. That's false. It's very industry dependent. So this time horizon where all factors of production are variable is dependent on industry. There are certain industries that could increase capacity and increase sales and increase production super rapidly. Either products or services. And there's other industries that's super slow. Because there's just so many things that need to happen for that to happen. So this is the big distinction between the two groups. Okay. And the other big distinction is because all factors of production are variable, I highlighted this last week, because all factors of production are variable, in the long run, we don't have what we call diminishing marginal product of labor. In long run, diminishing marginal product of labor or capital or other things is impossible. So do you remember what the concept of diminishing marginal product of labor is? If so, try to answer it in your head or out loud. And then, do you understand how it is impossible to have diminishing marginal product of labor in the long run? Answer that in your head or out loud as well. So first off, what is diminishing marginal product of labor? What does it refer to? Yes?
It says you add more variable factors of production to fixed factor of production. Eventually, the additional output that you get is going to decrease over time. Well, it's not going to be as much addition.
Yeah. So in a more precise setting, you said it generally, which is really good. In a more precise setting, if you have a fixed space with a fixed amount of ovens and everything else, and you add more and more workers, the variable production, variable input in this case, to a fixed space, fixed amount of ovens. It could be the opposite, having variable ovens with a fixed amount of workers. Doesn't really matter, one of them is fixed. Well, as soon as you add more and more workers to this fixed space, the extra worker, even though they're all perfect clones to one another, will not contribute as much to total production because of lack of ovens, lack of space, lack of anything that's required to being efficient. Okay? You could think about let's say here we had a certain amount of sewing machines, and I said we're gonna make sweaters today, and then there's 10 sewing machines and there's more than 10 of us here. Well, the first 10 people would be quite good because they have access to a machine, they could do a lot. But then the extra people could just be like that extra helping hand. But at a certain extent, adding one more worker will not really contribute that much in terms of total production. Because that worker doesn't really have access to too many resources to actually being productive and efficient. So why does that concept not arise in the long run? Why is that whole ideology of diminishing marginal product of labor impossible in the long run? Yeah?
Because everything's variable?
Exactly. Because in the long run, it's a planning process down the line into the future. And in that planning process, if I want to increase production, I'm not only hiring more workers, I'm hiring more workers, and I could increase the amount of space they have, I could increase the amount of ovens they have. I'm not limited. So if I think about the example with sewing sweatshirts here, well, I could say I want to produce double the amount that I was this year with 10 workers, so I'm going to hire more people next year, but I'm also going to get them more sewing machines, I'm going to have a bigger space. I had this space, I'm also going to rent out the other rooms on the other side of the hall, and so on. by having all that flexibility, I'm no longer limited by a fixed factor of production, because there is no fixed factor of production. Once again, it's that whole idea that in the future, down the line, there is nothing fixed. Once I get there, things are fixed again. Like, it's always that kind of like idea that, like, if I plan for years down the road and I say everything is variable in a year's time, I'm going to have this space and that space over there. Well, if I realize in a year's time that the sweaters I'm producing are much more popular than I expected, and I didn't want to double production, I wanted to triple, well, at that time period there, when I decide to increase production even further, well, now I'm constrained. I don't have that extra flexibility. All the other rooms are rented out, all the sewing machines are sold out, and so on. So at some point into the future, you fall into this kind of like short run scenario of limited resources, fixed resources. But when you're foreseeing that idea, when you're in that planning process, everything is possible. Yeah. So just see this as a planning process, and the short run kind of scenario is more of a reality at a specific given time, depending on the amount of ovens you have, the amount of space you have. Okay. All right. So that kind of sets the tone for this chapter. And then there's a few things that you might need clarity on, so I'll just cover those right now. So in the past, we had this kind of long run average total cost curve. So if I put this as my cost and my quantity of output, so it's the exact same labels on both axes as when I had the short run production functions and short run cost curves. It's the exact same thing, but now I'm going to have the long run cost curve, and I'm only going to focus on one. And there's two different ways you could call it. You could either call it long run ATC or long run AC. Depending on the textbook you look at, it might be different. It's one of the two. And I'll explain why both are valid. Well, in reality, this long run cost curve that we look at is a long run cost curve that shows the average total cost per unit. Similarly to when we had the short run cost curves in chapter 7, we had that kind of ATC cost curve that was looking at the average cost per unit for different levels of output. It's the same idea there. So I'd say instead of being the short run average total cost curve, it's the long run average total cost curve. Well, why can we also call it the long run average cost curve without having the total? Well, it's because in the long run, we don't make a distinction between variable and fixed. So there is no such thing as long run average variable costs and long run average fixed costs. There's just costs, they're all variable. So it's long run average cost is just kind of like putting them all together. I like to refer to it like this because it kind of links better to what is seen in the short run, but in reality, a lot of textbooks cover it that way. Same thing. Okay? But when we dealt with short run cost curves, the reason why we had this downward sloping section was due to specialization, and the reason why we had this upward segment was due to diminishing marginal product of labor. This no longer is the case in this chapter because we have an infinite amount of resources available. That's not the reason why we have those situations. So here, we could split this whole kind of average cost curve into 3 segments. So here we're going to be talking, for the 2 extreme ones, there's kind of 2 different words you could use that mean the exact same thing. So here we're going to say that this is increasing returns to scale, the first segment, or more commonly known as economies of scale. So this is for this kind of like segment here where the long run average cost is downward sloping. We'll kind of get back to the idea behind the long run average cost downward sloping. Then here we have our constant returns to scale. This one pretty much just has one name. And then we have decreasing returns to scale. Or diseconomies of scale. Okay. I guess the first thing I could kind of cover before I move into that is another part that for some is confusing, and is this general idea that this long run average cost curve is an envelope of short run average cost curves. So this is my long run average cost, and if I think about my short run average total cost curves, well, I could have one that kind of looks like this. I'll just write it as 1. And I add the SR. Normally, when the SR is not there, it just means average total cost. It's the exact same thing, and so on. Okay. So for some, this is confusing, and it makes sense for it to be confusing. It kind of looks weird, and it's just not intuitive when you just look at it if it's not explained to you. So I'll explain it, and hopefully it becomes clear, but feel free to ask questions throughout. Yeah. So first off, the first thing that should make this intuitive is the idea that what does this graph represent? Okay, let's just think about the whole meaning behind this graphical analysis. Well, in both cases, whether we're dealing with long run or short run, we're dealing with average total costs, or average costs. We said the equivalency in the long run, but we're dealing with average total costs. And what does average total cost represent? Well, average total cost tells me that for a certain level of output, what is my cost per unit on average? So if I produce water bottles and I produce 1,000 of these, what will be my cost per unit? I don't know, $10, let's say. I produce 3,000, what is my cost per unit? Well, my total cost will be greater, but my average total cost talks about my cost per unit. So maybe at 1,000 units, it cost me $10 to produce, but at 3,000 units, it cost me $8 on average to produce one of these water bottles. Okay? So when we're talking about this, we're talking about the average cost per unit. And when we make the distinction between short-run average total costs and long-run average costs, we say that it is impossible for a short-run cost curve to go through the average total cost curve and to be lower than the average total cost curve. Because in the long run, if we could foresee with a crystal ball what's our production level going to be in a year's time, we can choose the most ideal size of our firm to produce at the cheapest cost possible those units that I want to produce. If I know I'm going to produce 5,000 water bottles in a year's time, and that's going to be like the number of orders, not more, not less, I could try to determine what's the optimal space that I should have, what's the optimal amount of workers I should have, what's the optimal amount of machines that will allow me to produce that many units at the lowest cost possible. So it's impossible for a specific short-run scenario where some factors of production are fixed for it to be cheaper. Because in the long run, I have absolute flexibility on all factors of production. It's impossible, and it's a situation that I'm more restrictive, more restrained, that it becomes cheaper. It wouldn't make any sense. So hopefully this clarifies when we kind of go through these three short-run average total cost curves. So what would be the difference between these three short-run average total cost curves? Why is there a three? Like normally we only see one. What could they represent? What could be the difference between them? Yeah.
Different alternatives producing the same thing.
Yeah, so different alternatives. Here, to be more precise, we would be talking about like different firm sizes. So here I could have like a situation that I have 1,000 square feet. Here I have 1,500 square feet and more ovens or whatever. And here I have 2,000 square feet. If we disregard the black line for a second here, like just completely remove it from your image and just focus on the three kind of short run average total cost curves, it will make sense. If I were to kind of extend them a little further, it's going to make even more sense. Okay? So if I keep on drawing them a little bit more, blah, 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 have this kind of situation over here. So if I look at producing this amount, let's say it's 1,000 units. Okay? In this situation here, my cost per unit, when I go up from 1,000 and I intersect with the curve I'm looking at, here might be like, let's say, $10 a bottle. That is my cost for having the firm of 1,000 square feet. But if I produce 1,000 water bottles and I have a firm of 1,500 square feet, well, now I have a situation where it might be $15 per bottle. And if I have a firm that's 2,000 square feet, it might be like $18 per bottle. And the reason for that being that if I only produce 1,000 units, it doesn't make any sense for me to having a very large firm. If I only produce 100 sweaters a month, it doesn't make sense for me to rent out this whole building. I could do it in a smaller space. It's just wasting energy and cost. Like it's wasting money I have to spend on rent. It's wasting rooms I need to heat up. It's wasting a bunch of different resources. So if my production level is really low, it's cheapest for me out of all three sizes that I can have to be the smallest size. But it's not always true that it's the cheapest to being 1,000 square feet. If I go here and I produce, let's say, 4,000 units, well, in this case here, if I go back to my firm size of 1,000 square feet, over here for 4,000 units, it's going to be extremely costly per unit to producing 4,000 units because I'm going to have to hire a lot of people that are not efficient because they don't have much space. They don't have much that they can contribute because of diminishing marginal product of labor. 1,500 square feet won't be as expensive because then the people are more efficient. But in reality, my optimal size for my firm at 4,000 units per day is 2,000 square feet. Okay. So there's always going to be an optimal size for any level of output. Okay. If I ask you to produce 100 sweaters monthly or 110 sweaters monthly or 120 or 200 or 500 or 10,000, the optimal size to producing that amount of units will depend on the amount of units that you're asked to produce. But there's going to be one specific optimal size. The less I'm asking you to produce, the smaller you're going to want to be. The more I'm going to ask you to produce, the bigger you're going to want to be. In the long run, because you have absolute flexibility on that size, you will always be producing at the cheapest possible size. So if I were to draw out like a ton of these long run average cost curves, like I set one up for 1,000 square feet, 1,500 and 2,000, but in reality there's one that's going to be like 1,100, 1,200. Like there's a lot of these. There's tons of these short run average cost curves for every single possible size of the firm that exists. Every possible combination. So there's a ton of them. And the long run cost curve will always choose whichever one is cheapest. So if I were to draw like a bunch of these cost curves on a graph and I were to ask myself for this quantity here, what's the cheapest? Well, this one's cheaper than this one, than this one, than this one, than this one. So this is the cheapest possible size that I have. This is my cost per unit for that specific quantity. Okay? That's how it's constructed. So it looks at all possible sizes and it determines this is the cheapest it could be. Therefore, this is the price that I can access if I'm planning things out appropriately. Okay? I know this is abstract a little bit when you see it the first time. Is it clear? Like, any questions? Might take a bit of time to sink in. Yeah?
If you were to ask something like this on an exam, like would you want us to draw something like that or find the cheapest option? I guess I'm trying to understand.
So questions that have arisen in the past in terms of multiple choice questions, on that would be more like stating that the long run average cost curve is an envelope of all short run average cost curves. Or maybe mentioning that you cannot achieve a lower cost per unit in the short run than in the long run because you don't have complete flexibility. It could be just the same price if you're already at the appropriate size but can't be cheaper. Those are the big things, I guess, to understand from this. There'll be more questions along what we'll get back to here. But otherwise, there's not a ton. But you still have to kind of get the general idea. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, so we've established that it's in the envelope and we're finding the cheapest cost possible. So regardless of this, even though we're finding the cheapest cost possible, as we produce, there's this downward segment. There's this segment that normally would be treated as completely flat, and there's potentially this upward segment. We have to understand what each of these represent, and then understand how they work in the marketplace in a certain way. So the complicated part, I guess, from these definitions is the words used, meaning returns to scale. So what we mean here by returns to scale is based on the idea that if I were to scale things up, so if you think about like, I don't know, like you take a picture and you're magnified at 1x, and then you press on the telephoto lens and now you're magnified at 2x. Like you're zooming in, you're scaling up, you're making the person, the image, whatever's in the frame bigger. You're scaling things up by a certain factor. Well, here what we mean by scaling things up is that we're increasing all factors of production by a certain level. So it could be that I increase the amount of workers I hire by 10%. I increase the amount of ovens I have by 10%. I increase the floor space I have by 10%. I increase everything by 10%. So when I talk about increasing the scale, it represents increasing all factors of production by whatever, X%. Okay? That's what I mean by the returns to scale part. But we'll talk about the increasing constant or decreasing returns to scale part in a second. Okay? So increasing, when I talk about just increasing the scale, it's increasing all factors of production by X%, a given percent. So if I have here what we're referring to when we're talking about increasing returns to scale, constant returns to scale, and decreasing returns to scale, and it's highlighted in your notes, it's the relationship between what percentage increase you will create on output versus what percentage increase are you doing on your inputs. So as in the previous example I gave you, if I increase the amount of workers I have by 10%, the amount of ovens I have by 10%, the floor space I have by 10%, I increase all factors of production by 10%, and that leads to a 30% increase in my production. Well, the scale that I added, like I added 10%, and the outcome is 30% more. I have an increasing returns to my scale. It's greater than what I added in. Okay? Whereas constant returns to scale would be for me to say, I increase the amount of workers by 10%, the ovens, the space, and everything by 10%, and I'm going to increase my output by 10% as well. So my factors of production, everything else, the multiplication scenario will be the same on inputs than outputs. And decreasing returns to scale is a situation where I might increase my space by 10%, my amount of ovens by 10%, and everything else, but my production only increases by 5%. I'm not getting as much bang for my buck in terms of changes in output than what I'm putting in terms of money, in terms of changes in inputs. So here I have a greater percentage change in output over percentage change in input. Here, percentage change in output is equal to percentage change in input. And here, percentage change in output is smaller than percentage change in input. Okay. Ideally, if you're growing, you're in this first category. Coming back to my idea that there's 10 of you working in this room with a certain amount of sewing machines, certain amount of space. If I could all of a sudden expand and have like 2 rooms, have 20 workers in total, twice the sewing machines and everything else, and instead of only producing 1,000 units per day, I now produce 2,500 units per day. So I've doubled my inputs, and normally if I'd have constant returns to scale, I'd also be doubling my outputs, but I more than doubled my outputs. It's a situation where I'm getting increasing returns to scale, or economies of scale. Okay. So that's one way to view it. The other way to view it, as I mentioned, this curve here represents my cost per unit. If I go from point A over here to point B over here, I am increasing my quantity of output, and my cost per unit is falling. Your cost per unit is falling not because your total costs fall. It's because the increase in your input costs is smaller than your increase in your output, so therefore your cost per units are going down. Same kind of situation as I had with the sweater example, 2 different rooms. Now you're producing more than double the amount. Well, if I was paying the same amount for workers before as the new workers, if my costs doubled, but I more than doubled production, it means that the cost for each unit produced must be going down. Okay. Economies of scale is a concept you'll hear about a lot in the news and in different courses. It's what we try to achieve. It's what we try to gain as much as possible if we produce. Why? Well, if I could be in a situation that I start off here and I go to a situation that I go over here, I almost halved my cost per units. Therefore, it's much better. Let's say I used to be producing these bottles and I was competing against Nalgene and all the other kind of water bottle equivalents or substitutes. And at first, producing one of these was like $20 and I was selling them for like $30. And all of a sudden, I feel a lot of competition from all the other businesses that produce something similar. And they're starting to sell their products for like $20 or maybe $18. And I'm like, shit, can't compete with that because they're selling for the price that it cost me to produce it or even less. I'm not going to start selling these for $18 if I could only produce them at $20. Well, one of the strategies might be to say, I'm going to expand production because I know there's demand for this product. And if I could expand production and become more efficient as I expand production, and I could start producing these water bottles now at $9 a piece because I've achieved economies of scale, well, now I could start selling them cheaper and compete with these firms better. Okay? So economies of scale is when you can start producing things cheaper as you are producing more of them. It's a desirable outcome. You can't always choose to produce more if no one's there to buy your product, but a typical industry that has like high economies of scale is the airline industry, like producing airplanes. When Boeing or Airbus gets a new contract, a big contract, they're winning big time because for each plane that they produce, if they decide to produce more, the cost for each of those planes goes down. Why is those industries such a big situation when we have economies of scale versus running a restaurant or something else? Is because to produce an airplane, you need a ton of technology and you need a ton of like really specialized resources, engineers, and everything else to make sure everything works out well. But if you're only producing 10 airplanes a year or 20 airplanes a year, a lot of that very specialized staff, you'll already have them. You'll already have the technology. You'll already have the machines. All you might have to do is get more workers on the assembly line putting things together. And by just having to hire a few more workers on the assembly line, and they're not that expensive compared to everything else, all the space, the hangar space that you need to have, all the specialized machine, all the very well paid engineers, you only need more assembly line workers to produce double the amount. You know for sure that your cost per unit is going to go down. Okay? So you might have a situation where normally you're hoping to sell these planes for a few $1 million, and since you get such a big contract, your production costs go from like producing them at $2 million a piece to maybe producing them at like $1.3 million each. And now you could be even more competitive compared to other people. The bigger you have scale, the more you're producing, the more competitive you can be. Okay. That's why when we think about different car manufacturers or SpaceX or anything else that decide to produce more and more of a certain product, the more you produce, you could often be more competitive because you're getting economies of scale. And that's why if ever you do international business courses, you might have like different countries that if there's a new industry coming up in their country that's very competitive in this nature, they might kind of subsidize that company initially, and they'll give it the infant industry argument that if the company is very small, it might be very hard for them to compete against everyone else that's very well established and has a high production level. So they're going to subsidize them until they get to a proper size that they can compete on their own with all these other manufacturers. Okay, so some industries are more prone to this than others. Naturally, all businesses have some level of economies of scale. If we go back to the idea of opening up a coffee shop, and I say, well, you're opening up a coffee shop and you produce 20 coffees in a day, or you produce 40 coffees in a day, well, if your staff's already there, your machine's already there, and everything else is already there, yes, you could assume that producing 40 or double the amount of coffees will not cost you double the amount. So you're getting economies of scale by producing more. That is true. But it's true up to a certain size. Then when you have to start expanding because you've reached capacity, you can't produce more coffees in a given day without growing in size. You just can't service that many people. Well, then you might have a situation of constant returns to scale. A situation of constant returns to scale is I have a restaurant here in Lennoxville, a vegan restaurant, whatever, and I decide to open up a second restaurant in Magog. And I want to double my output in terms of the two restaurants combined. Well, I won't really gain much economies of scale by opening up this second restaurant because I'll have to have a separate manager for the other location. I'm going to have other workers for the other location and other rent and everything else. The only thing I might gain in having two businesses, which is going to reduce my costs a little bit, is just kind of like advertising, I might have like better negotiation for cheaper prices of food products because I'm going to be a bigger buyer in a certain way. So there might be slight advantages, but they're very small. So in that situation, it's a situation of constant returns to scale. I decide to grow, but I'm not able to reduce my per unit cost drastically by growing. Doesn't mean it's bad to grow. It's just not as beneficial because in this situation here, you're in a situation that by growing, you're able to produce cheaper, and by producing cheaper, you're able to sell cheaper or to sell at the same price and make a lot more profit. That is very interesting. And it drives out competitors for sure. Like I remember when I was younger, grew up in like Bolton, Mansonville area, and family friends had one of the lumber mills in that area. And at one point, I spoke with one of the guys who was an owner of that lumber mill, and he said that the price that Rona and other businesses charge for some of their wood, the selling price was sometimes cheaper than their production price. So it's very hard to compete against someone when they could produce and sell it and make a profit at a price that is smaller than you can produce that good. That drives out competition. By becoming big enough that your cost could get low enough can make you drive out competition pretty rapidly. So it's something that's desirable to have. But some industries, if I think about restaurants, yes, producing up to capacity will drive down costs, but then when you reach capacity, if you want to grow and you want to have a second restaurant, it's going to be more like constant returns to scale. And decreasing returns to scale, this upward segment here, is no longer characterized by diminishing marginal product to labor. Here it's a situation where the company is becoming too big and it's mismanaged. It's not properly managed. So some businesses just become so large that you have a situation where some of the managers in the business are trying to manage too many things at the same time and they don't manage it well enough, which drives the costs back up. This is not a desirable state. If you realize that this is happening, you might want to split off your operations. I'm not saying this is the reason why Bombardier did it, but many years ago, Bombardier was like one company, and then they split up between their rail and flights and all of their recreational products. They split into two different businesses. They found that made more sense. Well, sometimes there's other businesses that become too large, and at some point they're like, we had some advantages as being a large company, but if things are getting improperly managed, we should split up and it's going to become more well managed and it's going to drive back down our costs. So this is not a desirable state here. Okay? So I'm not saying that this commonly happens. It doesn't. Normally, if you see that you're getting to the point that you're becoming very costly to produce, you're going to find a way to drop back down costs by like splitting things up, but it does happen. It's something that can happen. But what we notice more is these first two phases. Any questions here? Okay. So, just something to keep in mind. If you're going to start up a business, you want to decide first off, like the biggest decisions you'll ever have to make if ever you release a product and you get invited to the Dragons or you decide to release product on Kickstarter or start your own business, whatever it may be. The first question you often have to ask yourself is, what price should I charge? And that price, then afterwards, you should try to determine as well, what kind of output am I aiming for? What kind of production level am I aiming for? If you charge too high and you have like very low sales, you might have a situation that's very costly for you to produce. But if you charge just a little bit less, if it could drive your sales a whole lot more and then drive down your cost of production greatly, you might be more profitable by charging a lower price. It's just something to keep in mind. So yeah, you really want to keep in mind your production costs and the situations where you have a lot of economies of scale are the situations where you have a lot of what we call overhead costs. All the costs that are there regardless of whether you have 1 unit produced or 50,000 units produced. Okay, so in the example we did in Chapter 7, looking at different costs of production, well, in that whole discussion there's different things that are seen as variable costs and other things that are seen as fixed costs. Well, if you have a lot of what we consider fixed costs that do not vary with level of production, well, that's a situation where you have a lot of overhead. You have a lot of costs that you have to pay for regardless of how much you produce. And those industries are the industries that will have the greatest economies of scale possibilities. The ones that don't have a lot of overhead costs, you won't have a lot of economies of scale. Let's say start a business as a massage therapist, and I just do it remotely. I go to people's houses. The only cost I have really is a table and maybe my car, and I already have a car, So it's very minimal. If I decide to expand and I have this kind of chain that I hire another massage therapist, it's very cheaply for me to double the amount of production I have. Okay, there's not much overhead cost involved. I might have a basic website, or I might just kind of post things up on like websites that have like a lot of different therapists on it at a very minimal cost. So in that situation, for me to double production, I'll be more like in this kind of constant returns to scale format. But if I'm producing something that's very costly for me to set up, like let's say I buy like $500,000 worth of machinery and excavation work, very specialized machinery, and I only got a few contracts, well, those few contracts will be very costly for me. And if I get more and more contract and I really use that machinery as best as possible, well, in that situation, that cost per contract becomes lower. So I'm kind of distributing that cost on more things. So sometimes you need to reach a certain scale. Okay. Any questions? All right. So I was going to move to the other chapters, but I feel you guys probably got saturated enough with this discussion here. So we'll leave it to that, and we'll get to the other discussions as we go through the other chapters. I'll wish you guys a good day, and I'll see you guys next week.